here we are. Welcome to our favorite subject, scaling and, well, partnerships. I'm here with two of our phenomenal Observer Circle members of Synergia, Ben and Roseanne. And instead of me introducing them, I would love for them to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about their background, where are they in the world, what are they doing, what keeps them up at night and during the day, and how did they end up doing what they're doing in the first place. So who would like to start? Maybe Roseanne, ladies first
Sure.
today. Maybe.
Sure, happy to start. So thanks for having me, Lucy. So Rosanna Rotundo, I am recently retired from Novartis Pharmaceutical, where I worked for 18 years. And my background is I'm a registered nurse by training. So got into the pharmaceutical industry as a clinical research nurse and worked in research and development for many years. And then eventually moved into the access space. So my recent job at Novartis was head of global health access, which is really where I found my passion and purpose of access to medicines, equality. I've always been passionate about equality across many different facets, but I think healthcare became truly my passion. Working in global health, seeing firsthand on the ground the inequity of healthcare, and just the large gap between what first world countries have and what low income countries have. Became my passion. And I was in the industry for almost 40 years. And now I am retired. I do some independent consulting, a lot of pro bono work and some for pay work to balance it. And yeah, still probably will always keep my hand in access in some way.
Brilliant. So happy to have you. And I'm happy to say that a lot of the pro bono work you do is also connected to some of our work at Synergia. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah,
And Ben, tell us about yourself. Same
Yeah,
question.
thanks, Lucy. Happy to be here. Thanks for the invitation. So I'm Ben Davis, currently head of social impact at Kenvue. Kenvue is the former Johnson & Johnson consumer health companies. Not a very well-known name, but some of the brands that we work with are very well known, such as Tylenol, Listerine, Johnson's Baby, etc. So I've been in that role for 3 years now. Having been part of the spin out from J&J, where I did spend close to 10 years actually working in the global community impact team, firstly in the EMEA region, and then globally working on what was then called the Center for Health Worker Innovation, which was about creating ecosystems of partnerships. A lot of it around access, a lot of it in low mid-income countries. Prior to that, spent some years working in sustainability in the retail industry and some networks on corporate social responsibility. I am based out of Belgium, have traveled a lot in my career, not traveling so much anymore, which I'm quite enjoying actually. And I have a background in international politics, business, and that was one of the reasons I got into this space, which was the gray zone between public-private sectors and obviously the NGO sectors, and always been quite kind of driven by the values approach. My parents ran a children's home in Norway. That's my background in Norway, and so they moved there from the UK. So I've always had that kind of connection. It's quite interesting because they worked with Save the Children back in the day, and now I'm working with Save the Children. So it's a fun kind of full cycle actually, or circle. Yeah.
Nice. Well, I mean, I'm so blessed to be working with people like you. So Ben, thank you so much also for supporting the work that we do. I think we all share this passion that impact is more than just obviously financials, and that brought us to the same space, and that brought us to Synergia. For those of us who would be listening to this podcast who have no idea, Synergy is essentially speaking the scaling infrastructure for startups and scale-ups who work in the space of health and sustainability. And we do a lot of work on partnerships. So this is why I wanted to dedicate a little bit of time to hear from the experts, And most of the audience that we're going to have are people who are building their companies or people who are building NGOs, because not every startup or scale-up is for profit. Most of them are, in terms of the infrastructure we are building, but many of them are also not. So I want this conversation to be having both of these hats when we're talking to, let's say, the founders out there, when we're just discussing concepts which might be around partnerships, which could be useful for them. So let's just try to have an organic learning experience maybe through this conversation. And I'll start with an open, provocative question, Lucy style. What is a partnership which was so unsuccessful that you had in your, let's say, career span that you thought, oh my God, I definitely learned good deal out of it, and then, you know, you went ahead in your career and you changed something? I know I love to put you on the sweet spot. I'm giving you 2-3 seconds to think about, because I think of a lot of those unsuccessful partnerships I've had, and some of them were quite painful afterwards. So that's why I'm asking the question, because it's easier to hear some good stories and think, oh, it's very good to do, but maybe it's more easier to learn from difficult stories, if you understand what I mean, and just give tips and tricks. So I stop talking now because I gave you enough food for thought for 2 minutes. Who wants to start and then just jump in? And I you're Roseanne, you're on mute.
Yeah, it's funny. It's funny how you sort of don't forget too much about the ones that didn't work, because you kind of move on and you forget about it and then you walk away. But I guess one, and I won't name the company, but where, we were looking for a diagnostic company to reduce their rates for a much needed diagnostic test for one of the sub-Saharan African countries. And we were lowering our prices for the medicine, and we wanted them to do the same for the diagnostic. And we got a lot of pushback. And, basically we're told every reason why they couldn't possibly lower it any more than they were already lowering it, which was already, the price of a family's food for 2 months, right? So that it just was not going to be reasonable. And I think, I think the people we were talking to, I think they were in the right place. I mean, they very much wanted to lower the price to what we were asking, but they were having a hard time convincing their upper management to do the same. And, because it was a program that my team and I were so incredibly passionate about, it became incredibly frustrating to not get them to see the value of what we were trying to do. And, sort of the do good for the world piece, but also like, here's why it makes sense, because eventually you'll get into this country. Eventually you'll be able to, it'll be volume, et cetera, et cetera. And we had several meetings with them, and we thought we were getting there, and then we weren't getting there. And then they told us one price, but then they came back and said, well, no, it's not going to be that. It's going to be a little higher. And we had a very specific, like, it cannot be higher than X, than what we knew was going to be acceptable to the country. And I think the frustration there was the people we were talking to wanted to do it, or seemed to want to do it, but they just could not convince their upper management to go there. And we didn't want to walk away because they were the biggest diagnostic company for what we needed. And we just really saw, for us, this just made total sense. It's like you start out lowering the price, you get higher volume, eventually the volume, gets bigger and bigger. And we ended up walking away because, and when I tell you, we got very close to the price we wanted, but it was still going to, when we went back to the country, it was still going to be too high. And I think they were frustrated because they felt they came down enough, and we were frustrated because they didn't come down enough. and so we ended up saying, no thanks, but no thanks. We'll look for another company.
Retrospectively, is there anything else, if you were in the same, let's say you transport yourself back in time, is there anything else you could have done differently?
Yeah, I think a few things. I mean, I think we made some assumptions about, of course they're going to do this because this is the right thing to do, and thinking that everybody thinks like we do, and everyone will get the support. And I think we were probably not as prepared for that first conversation. I think, we were prepared in terms of we had nice slides and we knew what we wanted and we knew the value, but I don't think we were prepared to get the very strong no. And I don't think we were in a place of negotiation to say, well, all right, well, if they don't do this, maybe we could do this. We kind of were like tunnel vision. This is what we have to have. And I think they were kind of tunnel vision of this is the lowest price we can go. And yeah, I think it was it was a project that all of us were incredibly passionate about. And when you're passionate about something, you tend to filter out all the other stuff because you're so passionate, you just assume everyone is going to join you in your passion. And realizing that, business is business, and sometimes it's just a no. And, it doesn't matter how much passion you have. So we both walked away. We looked for other options. I will say eventually, and I think it was probably 2 or 3 years later, we were able to get what we wanted. And they did come around and they lowered their price. And as far as I know, that's still happening. But it kind of, and I think the learning was realizing that not everybody shares your passion. Not everybody has, not every company has the flexibility to lower prices or to go above and beyond. I mean, we were willing to go to a no profit model where, as long as we sort of broke even, which we didn't even do that, but we were really in it for health equity. We were in it for global health access, and they were still in it as a business. And so our models were very different and our thinking was very different. And we didn't really, I mean, I'll be honest, I didn't even think about, oh, they may feel differently. I just thought, well, everybody wants to do good in the world and everybody's going to join us.
So thanks for sharing that example. Ben, is your example very different? I'm very curious, what is your example?
Yeah, I think different, but not different. I think, well, I won't mention any names, but I think, throughout my career working in kind of global private sector type of organization, is that there has always been this kind of, I would call it a myth to some extent, that there is always one partner out there or one organization out there that can fulfill a global delivery in parallel to what we're trying to do as a global company, right? So you're always looking at this kind of to connect with, I would say, rather large organizations that have a presence everywhere, or maybe everywhere, but not exactly in all the markets you want to be in. So I think that kind of one partner to solve all challenges and all type of programming has been something I've come up against a lot in my career. And I think my reflection on that is that it's an internal and external challenge, because you do need to spend quite a bit of time internally to kind of make leadership understand that there isn't always one solution that fits all our needs, although from a kind of cost saving and synergy perspective, it makes a lot of sense. And of course, also externally is understanding governance. Governance of large organizations sometimes becomes a challenge. I'm not sure, Rosanna, if you've had that challenge too, but I'm just thinking of, because you think you're working with a global organization, but of course they have local chapters and they might not necessarily be speaking to each other as well as we would hope they would be, or probably a little bit representative of ourselves as well. And so sometimes you think, okay, we're going to, move forward with one solution fits all, but actually you spend so much time retrofitting, trying to make it work, politicking, stakeholdering, problem solving, that I think the big miss here really, and I do keep walking into the same trap, which is like, yes, this time it's going to work, but actually I'm not sure that it really does. And I think finding local competence is really, really such an important factor here, that global is not always the way to go, but finding those local connections who have, footing on the ground, understand local markets, understand the context more than anything, and can build human relations at a local level. That for me has been something that I've missed a few times throughout my career. And I'm still learning, because I'm still believing that there must be something out there that can kind of solve this from a global kind of funding perspective. But I think the only way to go is local. That's my conclusion.
This is very interesting. So I'm picking up a couple of learnings, and I'm sure I'm not being exhaustive here, but depending on who your partner is, their frame could be different than yours. So that's the first thing I picked up from what both of you are kind of saying, because when you're a very large global organization, maybe you have one frame. When you're a small organization locally, you have another frame. Even if you're two very big corporates, you can have completely different frames. And then the second piece linked to that is your goals. So it's not necessary that you don't share the passion that you want to do good or have impact, but your organizational goals are quite different. And the third piece that I'm picking up is that it's not enough to convince your external partners. You have to convince everyone inside your own organization, including people who are not in the room. So if you're to give kind of like now advice very pragmatically to young companies, and we're talking about startups and scale-ups, companies building in healthcare, some of them building medical devices, some of building consumer health things, some of which may be working on medications that are creating, young biotech companies, others working delivering services. So different types of companies. If you think of different young innovators who are now starting to build their first partnerships, how they should be approaching it, what are the top things that they should be thinking about of matching, not just finding the right partner, but like having the right kind of mindset going into, let's say, partnership discussions with maybe another organization of their size as the first question, and then a much larger organization than them. What they should be thinking about first? Whoever wants to kick it off, feel free to.
You want to go first this time, Ben?
Yeah, sure. No, happy to. Thank you. I would say one of the things that I've seen in my career has been, certainly from a kind of a startup perspective, is there's so much investment in either the product or the service, but I think investment in own leadership is so important, from a founders and leaders perspective, right? And I do remember, like in some of the work that we did back in J&J, which was around impact investment, so much of that focus was also on helping to build the kind of capabilities, leadership capabilities of the founders, of the leaders of the organization, because there's a tendency, I think we all have that in our corporate jobs as well. You forget about your own personal development, right? Because you're so busy doing day-to-day work. And I think, making time for that is extremely important. And I think coming back to, I cannot underestimate or underline that point enough, which is understand the governance, really, even from a kind of a founder's perspective, if you want to partner with anybody, kind of from coming back into, like, for example, partnering with a large corporate, understand the structures, try to understand the politics, try to understand where is the decision being made, what are the goals, what are the long-term goals, how serious are those goals in terms of like long-term investment, because things shift, things change. Of course, there's always an element of risk around that, but I think getting to understand that is fundamentally important. And some of the most successful partnerships that I have seen, at least, is where collectives come together. So in kind of not always the kind of bilateral relationship in a funding model or an investment model, but collectives coming together around a purpose, around a topic, kind of bringing in different strengths, different values. And I think that there's such a huge opportunity there, and kind of thinking, how can we go together, to kind of make things happen, make things change, as opposed to being very protective. And that was a revelation for me, like 7 or 8 years ago, where we kind of moved away from a bilateral donor perspective and kind of opened up into collectives. By doing that, you also give up some of your proprietary communication rights, which is a risk and a challenge. But at the same time, I think there's a huge opportunity to create more impact by doing that.
Brilliant. And Rosanne, how is it looking from your perspective? What tips or tricks would you give these guys who are listening?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Ben covered a lot of it. The one thing I would add is being clear on, what is the gap, or what's the knowledge that you're trying to fill, right? So what is it that we need from this other partner that we can't do ourselves, and being really clear on that, because I think sometimes we just assume like, oh, we need the partner to do this, and those internal conversations first need to happen about, what skill set do we need that we don't have internally, or what relationships that this other partner might have that we don't have. And I think that goes back to what Ben said about local. I think one of the biggest learnings is you have to have feet on the ground, especially in some of these countries where there's, they will only talk to people they trust. They do not want to talk to large corporations because they just assume you're there to take their money, and local connections to government. So if you need government involvement, typically you will get further with a local connection than, corporate from Switzerland or from New York. So I think, first really identifying what's the gap you're trying to fill, what's the need that you need, what is it that you need that you don't have internally, and then what's the goal of the partnership. That seems so simple, but yet oftentimes we don't slow down enough to take the time to have those conversations, and just to answer some of those simple questions about, what is it that we want out of this partnership? What are we bringing? What are we bringing to the partnership? What do we have to offer? And why should people partner with us? I think that's the other sort of, especially sometimes in big pharma, you just assume everybody wants to work with you because you're big pharma, but really, what are you bringing to the table? So that it truly is an equal partnership, and the partner is getting something out of it as well. And I think though, again, it sounds so basic, but being clear about, again, is it a diagnostic company? Is it a local, like if you're doing health system strengthening, you need a local partner who knows the local environment, the healthcare system, and then I think those first conversations with the partner, really building relationships and trust, and because any partnership, even in business, there's a personal piece to it as well as a business piece, and you sort of have to click with the people you're working with. There'll always be a difference in personalities, but you really have to know that, like, okay, I'll be happy on this call with this partner for, however many years that partnership lasts, and not someone who's like completely has a very different mindset. If your goal is access and their goal is profit, it's not going to work. So yeah, I think just taking the time for those basic fundamentals in those first assessments of a partner, and then those first introductory calls.
Another subject comes to mind. So in the typical startups environment, especially startups, or rather, let's say, founders coming from more under-resourced settings, usually the first thing coming to mind is, we need to fundraise. We need to find funding from somewhere. We need to immediately find funding from somewhere. How can partnerships which are non-financial, or what kind of partnership models which are non-financial, can help young startups, let's say pre-seed, seed level companies, actually generate or create value without spending additional money? Do you have some ideas in your mind, or examples from your work, or something that you have seen that has truly been successful without a financial, let's say without you buying services, or without you paying an implementing partner, more like truly a collaboration approach, like you said, maybe collective, to quote you, Ben? I would just like to spark ideas for our founders, because they usually think of fundraising as the most important thing.
Well, again, I think it sort of goes back to what I just said about what's the gap you're trying to fill. So if you're a diagnostic company, but you don't have the medicine, so you're going to diagnose something in a country, but they don't have access to that medicine, well, then you want to partner with somebody who has that medicine, who's willing to provide the access. If you have the medicine, but you don't have the diagnostic, then you have to partner with a diagnostic company. So it's not always exchange of funds. It's if you look at the whole picture of what you're trying to do, what's the missing piece? And to me, the diagnostic medication piece is sort of the easiest analogy I can think of, because Novartis was not a diagnostic company, and much of the time in low income countries, part of the issue is that these diseases are not being diagnosed because they simply don't have the equipment, and typically that equipment is very expensive. So then and it's oftentimes you're finding these startup diagnostics who are either building diagnostics for low income countries, or they have more of a willingness to like, okay, we'll put a couple of our machines in these clinics because we're going to get data out of them. So they're not getting any money, but they're getting the experience, they're getting the data they need. We're not getting any money. We're getting the diagnostic equipment that we need to be able to provide the access. So yeah, that's sort of the first example that came to my mind.
Yeah, I think, I think what you're saying there is a kind of, I don't know if the intent is, even if you build relationships, you might have in the back of your mind, it is also kind of a subliminal intrinsic fundraising in the future, right? So it's also about, network building, and I think understanding the value chain, as you're saying, Roseanne, in terms of, where can your product, your service have the most value, who's playing in that ecosystem. I think what I've seen has been quite successful, although you could argue there is funding involved, is kind of accelerators, in a sense where you kind of bring together those different actors in the value chain to help accelerate a particular type of deliverable effectively. Not all of that is just funding based. It's also about knowledge sharing. It's about pooling resources. It's about finding a kind of collective way forward. I would say that's a really interesting model and seems to work pretty well overall. Yeah.
And I think the one, Lucy, it just came to my mind because this was something that for me was like, oh, how did we miss this? Is, we often think of partnering as like funding, technical, but also partnering with patient advocacy groups.
Mm-hmm.
Or at least maybe it's not a partnership, but we're working with them or considering them, because sometimes they have the best connections and they know what they need better than anybody else because they've been advocating for themselves and their diseases. Yeah. And again, it's maybe not that typical partnership, but it's building that relationship with the patient advocacy group that sometimes is so missed because they will tell you what they need and they will tell you what companies they will and won't work for or with. And so I think it's thinking beyond just the financial and the sort of the typical piece, but it's, if you look at the whole ecosystem of what has to happen to make the access to your medicine or your diagnostics successful, that patient piece, the person piece, is so often overlooked until you've already developed it and it's already done. And then you bring it to them and they're like, this is absolutely not what we wanted and we don't need it. So I would just, get startups to also think about tapping into that advocacy group.
Very interesting. Maybe as startups, it's also challenging to always kind of find the right formula to start working with a big organization. Maybe Ben, this one is for you. I don't know too much about the projects that you run, but imagine that we run a startup or we have many interesting startups and one of these founders comes and says, hey, I'd love to work with Kenvue. What would actually create a negotiation power for these guys for you to even consider working with a startup? And do you work with startups? I'm just wondering out loud, how would someone position themselves as relevant to what you're trying to accomplish as a large organization compared to, let's say, a small startup?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment in the space I'm working in, no, we don't. To be yet, right? So, but I do know previously in J&J we did more. So when we had an impact investment arm to the social impact work, and there, what a lot of it actually came down to was the individual. To be honest, it was that connection because and I don't know, for example, if you watch, what is it, Dragon's Den on the BBC or something, you often see like the investors going like, I hate this idea, but you are great, right? And, I've seen similar, not necessarily that the ideas were bad, but it was also not only investing in the product, the service, but very much in the individual who's running the organization. And I think if you have the space to be able to make those type of investments, then I think that connection is hugely important. Coming back to what I was saying earlier, is also about your own development, how you're, kind of presenting yourself. And I think coming back again is like understanding what is, for example, if we were investing in startups, why? The question is why? Why is this company providing funding to do this? What are they trying to achieve by it? Is it something, to be part of a larger business plan? Maybe. Is it, purely part of philanthropic work? Maybe. Is it to kind of prove a point around investment models? Maybe. I think trying to understand what the key motivating factor is fundamentally important. Yeah.
With this, maybe I have one final closing question to the both of you. So what motivated you to join and support the Observer Circle of Synergia, and why should founders even consider it in their scaling journey? What would be your kind of message there?
Want to go, Roseanne, first?
Well, I mean, I'll be honest, because you asked me. and but no, in all seriousness, I think I know you, Lucy, and I trust you, and I admire your work, and I've seen your work, and so I knew that this was something that was going to be meaningful, impactful, and successful. If a random person had asked me, I don't know that I would be like, sure, I don't really understand what you're asking me to do, but I'm happy to help. So I think, and that gets to the personal connections, right? Why personal connections are so important, because, you may have somebody who you worked with 10 years ago then reach out to you that, and you remember, or you don't remember that connection as being positive or not so positive. So I think those personal relationships are key. And as much as we maybe don't want to think that, we're like, well, this is a business. I mean, the personal relationships are, it's who do you trust? Who do you enjoy working with? And, there's probably other people that may have asked me and I would have been like, thank you, but no. So I think that was a part of it. And then obviously, because I know that your passion is access and equitable health care, and bringing companies together and how to take the sum of the parts to be greater than the parts itself. It made sense to me what you were trying to do. And I remain passionate about, again, access in low income countries, and not just access to medicines, but access to expertise and education and experience. And so it was very aligned with my passion. And I trusted that I knew that whatever you were doing was going to be interesting and successful and have an impact.
Thank you, Rosa. That's very sweet.
It's true. It's true.
Yeah, I can echo that. I mean, I haven't known you long, Lucy, but I think your enthusiasm and passion for the project was very contagious, certainly. So you felt like, these people are serious and they have a lot of energy around this, which is always great. Go where the energy is good, right, is one of the mantras. But I think also, to kind of making the parallel to what I was saying earlier, is you only know what you know, but what about what you don't know? So for example, connecting local founders in maybe low and mid-income settings to capital funding opportunities is huge, because where would my mind initially go if I want to partner with somebody? It's probably to the usual suspects. But that's not to say, and I think I kind of mentioned that earlier, is the usual suspects don't always have the answer, far from it. So how can you really find smarter connections, smarter partnerships, and, kind of also looking to see how you can innovate, which is really exciting. So yeah, looking forward to seeing how it develops and how we can support you.
Brilliant. So I want to thank both of you for the time you made for Synergia, for the founders, for me once again, and for all your great insights. I think quite a lot of learnings come out of that. And to your point, we want to showcase some of the most successful joint ventures which came to BART actually in the last 2 months, in the next few weeks. So stay tuned for that. And thank you again. With this, I wish you a great afternoon.
Thanks very much, Lucy. It's a true pleasure.
Thank you so much.